Hello, my online learners. Welcome to Chapter 10, where we'll discuss the brain, the cranial nerve, and a little bit about the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system. Please realize there's a lot more in Chapter 10 than you actually need, that's on the learning outcomes, so you don't need to look at that in that great detail. Let's look at the reading guide will help you focus on what needs to be done. So when we look at it, the brain and the cranial nerves are responsible for the major control of the nervous system. The brain acts as the main processor and the director of the group. The cranial nerves leave the brain and they go mainly to the head, where they receive information and they send it back to the brain, or the brain sends information from, and then the brain sends information to the motor. So we're talking about the optic nerve, which takes information from your eyes and puts it back, but you also have the optic motor nerve, which will move your eyeballs. And we'll talk a little bit about those later. Again, more detail in this chapter than you really need to know. So, the brain, located at the top of the spinal cord and beginning of the foramen magnum. The foramen magnum is the big hole in your skull that enters from the top of the spinal cord. And it's divided into several anatomical structures and divisions. Now, the thing about the brain is they say it's plastic, because if one area is damaged, another area can pick up its function. So for me, that makes the studying of the brain quite frustrating. There is a little anatomical structure difference between all the different parts, but it's really hard to see what does what. Okay, so when you look at the external anatomy, you see the cerebellum, the cerebrum, which is the big part, the cerebellum, which is the cauliflower part at the bottom, and the brainstem that leads into it. The cerebellum is the big part, so let's look at the diagram here. So here's the cerebellum. Cerebrum. Here's the cerebrum. Cerebellum is down here. The LUM means little, so the cerebellum is the little brain. This is the big brain. The cerebellum itself is very convoluted, and that's to get more space. So imagine taking your hand, and if you squish it like this, you will get more tighter, more and less space, but you have these convolutions. These convolutions are called sulci, and then the spaces in between them are called gyri. Oops, I mixed those up. The gyri are the bumps. The sulci are the spaces. Just be familiar with the term. Do not worry about that being testable. What I want you to be aware of is the 4 lobes of the brain. So when you look at the brain, and it's divided by chunks, basically. So the first part is the frontal lobe, and this is the part that's involved in logical thought, speech, anything very now. Then you have the parietal lobe, which is behind it, the temporal lobe, which is kind of above your ears, and the occipital lobe at the back. The way I remember the occipital lobe has to do with sight is the fact that your eyes are over here, so it's kind of like your occipital lobe is a screen which your eyes can focus on. So let's look at it. Your frontal lobe is the most anterior. It's separated by the central sulci. It is responsible for motor activities that you think about, conscious thought, speech, logic, anything now and up to date. Then you have the parietal lobes. Parietal lobes is up above. Your parietal lobe is your sense perception and your language comprehension. Then you have the occipital lobes, which is responsible for vision, and your temporal lobes. Where I remember that is your temporal lobes are right over your ears, so they're involved in hearing, but they're also involved in integrating your motions. Okay? There's an area called the insula, which is now, it's not really a lobe, it's a section deep inside the temporal lobe. Sometimes people list it as the 5th lobe, and sometimes they list it as a part of the temporal lobe. So that's why we only have 4 lobes here. Okay? Now, the thing about the information on the brain, it's contralateral, which means the left side controls the right side. And so if you go like this and make your fists, here you have your right side of your brain will be controlled the left side of your body, and then same with the left side of your brain controls the right side of your body. Okay? So this way it will help you understand a little bit. Not a lot, but a little bit. There's also theories about being left brain, how left brain is more logical and right brain is more creative, but those are just theories. And if you take psychology, you'll learn more about them. Okay? The gyri are named for their locations. Don't worry about it. There's also an area in the frontal lobe called Broca's area, which is motor for speech. We're not going to get that specific on them, but if you're taking Psychology 261 later on, I just want you to be aware of these terms so you've heard them once before. There's also an area called Wernicke's area in the parietal, which functions for sensory information. Okay? The cerebellum. The cerebellum is divided into hemispheres. It's called the little brain, and it is involved in routine, repetitious information. So it's sensory, motor coordination, and balance. So this is, when you're talking about muscle memory, you talk about the areas down put into your cerebellum. Also, balance, posture, things that don't really require thought but are more automatic, they go to the cerebellum. Okay? So the cerebellum is down here and it looks like a little cauliflower. Good. There's a part called the brainstem. The brainstem has 3 structures. So if you look at the brainstem, it's inside. The brainstem comes up. You've got the spinal cord. Then you have the first bump, which is the medulla oblongata. The pons is the second bump, and then it goes to the midbrain. This is kind of seen as the basic brain, and lower organisms have a midbrain or a brainstem. So if you think of the fact that they're involved in basic thoughts and basic functions. So when we look at the brainstem has the medulla oblongata, which controls heartbeat, respiration, and blood vessel dilation. Very basic functions. Then you have the pons, and the pons is a respiratory regulator. Then the midbrain is just a pathway for visual and auditory impulses to send information up. Now, when it comes up, it goes to what's called the diencephalon. We'll come back to that. Let's go to the diencephalon and then we'll come back again. So the diencephalon is in the interior area. So here is our midbrain here. It comes up, first bump medulla, second bump pons, little squiggly at the top. Then you have the area above it called the diencephalon. Di means 2, but even in your textbook they have 4 parts. But the main ones are the thalamus, which is kind of the space here, and the hypothalamus, which is below it. We talked a little bit more about the hypothalamus when we talked about it being a gland regulator, because the hypothalamus will often regulate hormones that control the pituitary, which then sends out hormones to the rest of the body. So you also have the pineal gland, which is the one that releases melatonin, the daylight sleep hormone. And also, it doesn't include it here, but it includes it in other places, the pituitary gland here. But ideally, the diencephalon, di means 2, so it's 2 parts. The thalamus, which is controlled in regulating and a relay station, which makes sense because as soon as the information comes up the midbrain, first thing it goes to is the thalamus. So this is the relay station. Then you have the hypothalamus, which is there it is. The hypothalamus. Just a second. The hypothalamus also helps regulate and then talks to the pituitary. Okay? Good. So those are the parts that include it. And these parts interface with the endocrine system, such as the hypothalamus will talk to the pituitary. Good. Now, we talked about it briefly in terms of the meninges and the cerebral spinal fluid, but we talked about this in the spinal cord issue, but I want you to pay attention to how it works in the brain, because when you get a brain bleed, it will put pressure on your brain. So if you look at it, here is your skull bone, And then underneath your skull bone, you have your 3 meninges, your dura mater, your arachnoid, and then you have your pia mater. In between the dura and the pia and the arachnoid is called the subarachnoid space, and sub meaning below. So this is the area where blood vessels go, and this is the area also where the cerebrospinal fluid goes. So if you have any sort of increase in pressure in cerebrospinal fluid or a brain bleed, that will put pressure on the lobes of the brain. Now the cerebrospinal fluid is made to nourish and cushion the brain, which we talked about in the other parts, in the spinal cord one. Now, what I want you to realize is there are spaces inside the brain called ventricles, and these spaces inside the brain are where the cerebrospinal fluid will go. This is a frontal section of the brain. I just want you to realize it's complicated, but I'm not going to have you memorize any of these parts other than what the thalamus and the hypothalamus does. Okay? This is a good diagram to put it all together for you. Good. Now, cerebrospinal fluid is made in part of the brain, and it's actually it takes fluid from the blood and then it goes into the cerebrospinal fluid. So it's a reabsorption and a balance. It's since the brain is very delicate, the cerebrospinal fluid will cushion the brain. Also, though it makes the brain like it's floating in fluid, so anytime there's a concussion or a hit, the brain will jostle in this fluid. Good. There is the cerebrospinal fluid. Again, I want you to be aware here that the cerebrospinal fluid is made in the middle and it flows around the brain. I won't test you on the way it flows or anything about where it's made, just main function of cerebrospinal fluid. Okay, we talked about the cerebellum. Good. Cranial nerves. Cranial nerves, they're kind of halfway between the brain, the central nervous system, and the peripheral nervous system. So cranial nerves are like spinal nerves in that they have input or output, but they come from the base of the brain. Cranial nerves, there's a lot of detail on them. Again, you don't need to know this detail. I just want you to be aware of that. When you take your anatomy course next term, we'll go into more detail as to what the 12 of them are and what they do, but they are very specialized. Cranial nerves carry sensory and motor information from the head and neck, as well as visual, auditory, and taste. So I want you to be aware of them all. Notice how this is the underside of the brain. Notice how they're coming off, but you don't need to be aware of them right now. Good. Limbic system is something else I want to go to. Oh, yeah, limbic system. Then we'll come back to the autonomic nervous system. The limbic system is seen as an emotional mood memory part, and that's mainly what it does. It has all sorts of bits inside of it called the reticular system, and anesthesia inhibits the reticular system. So when you look at, where's my picture of my limbic system? Anyway, there's limbic system, basically emotion. That's all you need to know. Is this freaking out your eyes? Where does it show my picture of my limbic system? Maybe it's not in here. It's in the textbook. Anyway, the limbic system is also in here. Okay? Yeah, it's not on this picture. Don't worry about the location. Limbic system, emotion. That's really what emotion and mood. Good. Now, the last thing I want to look at is the autonomic nervous system. So we talked about the central nervous system, which is the brain and spinal cord. We talked about the peripheral nervous system, which is the outside of it. Now, I'm running out of time on this video, so I will finish off here and I will do a second video.